All right, everybody, welcome back to the Realty Rundown with the Nic Wyse Team. I am Nic Wyse, and with me, as always, is my co-host Nathan Schwartz.
That's right.
Uh, Today, we're tackling an important part of real estate. It's something I think we take for granted a little bit as agents because we do it so often. But it's what happens after a home goes under contract, or as it's called in other areas, into escrow. I had a friend one time ask me, like, "Oh, you get anything in escrow?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?"
What does that mean?
Yeah. Come to find out, different areas of the country refer to it differently. But
Yep.
basically, once you're pending is what we're talking about. So you've accepted a contract. So Nate, like I was mentioning, a lot of buyers and sellers don't understand the same terms that we do. So let's break down kind of what it means and answer that question: what actually happens when a home goes under contract? So for starters, when a home goes under contract, it means the buyer and the seller have agreed to the price and the terms of the sale. But the deal obviously isn't final yet. It's just that initial step. There are still several steps that need to happen before we can get to closing. So escrow is more of a process, if you want to think of it as a process that protects both the seller and the buyer. And typically, an independent third party, usually a title company, or in some areas they would use an escrow agent, is going to hold what's called earnest money, an earnest money deposit. That is going to ensure that all conditions of the contract are met before the sale is finalized.
Right. And the escrow isn't just about holding money. It also helps coordinate all the moving parts of the transaction, like inspections, financing, and final paperwork. So again, we'll walk through a little bit more about what actually happens once the home goes under contract.
Mhm.
Well, first, Nick, actually, once a home goes under contract, what's the first thing that happens? Tell us.
Yeah, so essentially, the first step is opening that escrow and submitting the earnest money deposit. And an earnest money deposit is kind of what it sounds like. It is money showing that you are in earnest going to fulfill on the contract that you've adhered to. So you are going to deposit that money into one of three places typically. It used to be common practice that it was held with the listing agent's office. You also have the option to have it held with the seller or the buyer's agent's
Mm-hmm.
office, or what some people choose to do is kind of avoid that altogether and deposit that money with the title insurance company. As far as like what that amount is, it's totally variable. I've seen it be $5 before,
Have you
which was a
actually?
transaction between friends. Yeah, you probably
Okay,
never
well,
seen
okay,
one
that
that
makes
low, I'm
sense.
guessing. Yeah. Yeah, the $5 doesn't come up very often. For a long time, it was kind of industry standard that for it to be $500. Now, that was back when I was starting out, 14, 15 years ago. More so nowadays, we see that be closer to 1 to 3% of the purchase price.
Yep.
Depends on a lot of factors, doesn't it? Like if you're making an offer to somebody and you want your earnest money to be one of the big pluses of that offer, you probably advise your people to go a little higher.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually had that with a client of mine where we were trying to beat out another offer, and he's like, does like more earnest money help? And I'm like, to some people it does. Like for
Yeah.
some sellers, they like seeing it. Some don't care, but I was like, it's definitely worth a try. And so he did, and that certainly helped him get it. But nevertheless, I digress. We then move into the contingency period. So what happens here?
Right. So the contingency period is kind of where everything happens, so to speak. There are a lot of contingencies that are part of your purchase contract, your purchase agreement, as we call it. So the number one thing that most people do that is elective is get a home inspection. It's definitely something we recommend in any
Yep.
situation where you can do it. You want to have that opportunity to have the home inspected by a licensed and independent home inspector. So not necessarily Uncle Joe who just knows a lot about houses. You want to call somebody who does this for a living, who is licensed. But it's important also that they're independent, that it's not Uncle Joe, because Uncle Joe is going to come in there and pick the home apart, trying to get a better deal for his niece or nephew. So this independent third party is going to come in and inspect it. He's going to do what is considered a whole house inspection, where they're looking at everything. I mean, they're checking every outlet, they're checking every nook, every cranny in the attic, in the crawl space, all those places that you don't want to go and don't want to check out. And there's a lot of other things that you can add on as well. So instead of just the whole house inspection, like Nate, what are some of the things that you see a lot of buyers asking for nowadays?
You mean like in regard to inspections?
Yeah.
Yeah, like you can do a septic inspection, a well inspection. Like if most of the time the like some of the inspectors that we use, they'll be like, hey, we noticed the water pressure was a little bit lower. I'd probably recommend you have a well inspection done. If they don't notice anything odd, they usually don't recommend it. But it's at your discretion if you want to do it or not. But we do recommend if you're buying a house with a septic on it, I would always recommend get a septic inspection done with your home inspection because the last thing you want to do is, well, I'll put it this way: it's worth spending $300 to make sure you're not walking into a $15,000 problem. So it's worth that peace of mind.
Yep. Yep. And worst case scenarios, there's, systems, if a septic system has failed and it's not discovered until after closing, $15,000 might be the minimum that you're looking to spend, on a traditional septic if there's room. Now, a lot of smaller yards that have septics don't have room for a separate system, because it basically, that old system has failed. Well, that's taking up a portion of the yard that can't be used anymore for a traditional in-ground septic system. So you might have to go with what's called a mound system. Now we're talking about $25,000 or $30,000. So definitely do your inspections whenever possible. There might be situations where, again, you're trying to beat out, other offers. We have started to see a little more of a pickup in the market overall. So we're starting to see some situations where there's multiple offers again. If you really want to make your offer stand out, excuse me, that is an option that you could waive your inspections. Just know the risks that you're doing by doing so.
Exactly.
Yeah. The next big process that we go through, the next big contingency, is the appraisal. So that is essentially independent. Well, if you watched last week, you know a lot about what the appraisal is.
Yeah, that's right.
You got to tune in with Kelly and listen to Kelly Avila kind of break it down what the appraisal is. But the contingency part of that would be if the home does not appraise for value, the buyer therefore cannot get a loan for. Now, when we say value, we should say the purchase price. So we'll throw a number out there, and a wonderful imaginary number of $100,000. You're buying a home for $100,000. It's got 10 acres. For some reason, the appraiser goes out there and she says, nope, this is only worth $80,000. Well, that number is the magic number for the bank. So they're not going to loan for any more than that number. The bank is the one who orders the appraisal, and the appraisal, although it's paid by the buyer, that is kind of the bank's property. It's for their benefit. It's to make sure that they're not making a bad loan. So again, if the appraisal value comes in less than the purchase price, now we have to go back to the two sides and basically renegotiate and say, hey, is there room, Mr. Seller, that you can come down, to this appraised value? They're probably not going to want to do that, especially if it's a big gap. So then we go to the buyer and say, is there any way you can come up with some cash to help make up the difference? And really at that point, that's one of those contingencies. The whole deal is contingent upon that being satisfactory. So if there is an appraisal gap, as we call it, you got to reinvent the whole thing. You kind of start back over at the beginning, and sometimes it ends up being other things that are sacrificed. Maybe a buyer was asking for some of their closing costs to be paid. Instead of that, they're willing to forego that if the seller will come down and match that appraised value. So a lot of things can happen if the appraisal is cut, including us getting mad at the appraisers. Tisk, tisk.
Yeah.
Terrible appraisal if you have ever cut a home. Sometimes it's valid, sometimes it happens. Financing approval would be the next big one. So this is really in large part reliant on the appraisal. Like we said, the financing is going to be reliant on the appraisal, but there are other factors. We just had a young man, Sam Atwater, is purchasing his home. Probably in a couple of weeks, you guys will close, I think, maybe sooner. It's kind of waiting for the financing approval, if I remember right. Big kudos to you, Sam. If you do get a listen to this, Sam's a wonderful young man. I knew him growing up in church, was always impressed by the way he carried himself. So when he contacted us and said, hey, I'm ready to buy my first home, I'm like, aren't you still 13? No, he's an adult now, but he's not very old. I think Sam is probably 19 or 20.
Early 20s, I think.
Yeah, and is out here buying his first home. So awesome. But right now, he's waiting for the bank to say, okay, we've done the appraisal, which they have. They're good there. They still have to go through and make sure that his financing is in order, which would be that he has not taken out additional lines of credit. If you are buying a home, please wait to buy furniture until after closing. Don't take out lines of credit. That can totally destroy not only your overall affordability or your ability to get the mortgage, your loan to value kind of a thing. I'm not using the right terms, but how much you could afford to buy. But it could also actually drop your credit score itself, eliminating the rate that you may have had when you first applied. So don't do it. And then the other step would be title insurance or the title search itself. There again, it's a title company. It's a third party that is going to be basically chosen or hired, and they're going to do a search on the property as well as on the buyer and the seller to make sure that there are no judgments, there's no liens, there's no encumbrances, there's no maybe covenants and restrictions, which we've seen. Sometimes you wouldn't expect it. Property out in the middle of nowhere somehow has covenants or restrictions attached to it because a previous seller put them on. That travels with the deed. So unless you can find that old seller and put them on and get them to sign off on it, those are going to go right with your property. So those are the final things that we're looking to make sure everything is in order and that everything gets processed in time for closing.
Yeah. And if everything checks out, we move forward. But what happens if there's problems during this process?
Yeah. We kind of touched on these. I kind of got ahead of myself. Surprise, surprise, that I ended up talking too much. But really, if any one of these things doesn't hit, so to speak, if any one of these things isn't cleared, the potential is obviously there for the whole deal to fall apart. And it can be tricky sometimes, especially if you've got, these people are selling their home so they can buy this home, and therefore those folks are buying this home. And we have what we call a domino effect, where if one of those things falls apart, it can fall apart for everybody. So it's definitely a very tricky thing. It's one of the reasons that we track things so closely. Big shout out to Shelly Solinger, who is our transaction coordinator for the Nic Wyse team and Remax Results. She just does an amazing job of keeping us up to date as far as where we are always at in the process. We always can refer back to her data spreadsheets and what she puts together for us. So we make sure that these things aren't happening, that it's not going to, somewhere down the line in a distant transaction, it's all going to fall apart. And then the other thing I guess we have to talk about, and I think we've talked about this a little bit before in past episodes, but what happens if a buyer just flat out gets cold feet? And they decide that they're not going to buy anymore? We've had it happen. It's one of those things we try and have this conversation up front with people and help them understand what specific performance is and why they have to adhere to the contract that they've signed and agreed to. Best case scenario, if you just get cold feet, all these contingencies are satisfied or waived, and you change your mind, best case scenario probably is going to be that the seller is going to keep the earnest money deposit and they will then release you from the contract. Worst case scenario, you may be going to court. You may be forced to continue with that contract that you've agreed to.
Exactly. We've kind of talked about issues on the buying side, but are there any issues that sellers could run into?
Yeah, there certainly are. Like, again, going back to the inspections, the buyer, submits an inspection response. The seller agrees to make the repairs and maybe doesn't make them completely or makes them somewhat dishonestly. There's certainly legal action that could be taken from the buyer then, even after closing has occurred. If they can go back and prove that the seller basically put Band-Aid instead of repairing an item, there certainly are rights and recourses that the buyer would have in those situations.
Yeah. Have you ever had that before, where like a seller just kind of did like a...
Yeah, I've never had one of mine. I've certainly seen it on the other side of things. It's really rare, I will say, and maybe that's because of where we live. I think people in our area tend to be good and honest people.
Right.
But there are some times you're like, that repair was pretty shoddy kind of a thing.
Yep.
And I have seen people, I've never had, I've never had to actually, go to court to help somebody fight over it, but we have had to go to our attorney that we keep on retainer at Remax, ask him to provide some guidance. And then, typically he's going to issue, a letterhead statement saying, hey, you're going to get sued if you don't fix this the right way. And that's as far as I've ever had it go.
Yeah.
So we've kind of had to threaten it, but we've never had to actually go through with full legal action because, we put things in the right place again to make sure that our buyers and sellers aren't in that dangerous situation to where they're going to be drawn into court. Because if you go to court over real estate transaction issues and you lose, you are going to be liable not only for your own attorney's costs, but the attorney's fees outside that won too. So prevailing attorney's fees.
So, it's worth it just to do it right.
Just do it the right way, guys. Just disclose defects, fix defects, do it all the right way the first time.
Yep.
So I know, Nathan, you do a lot of final walkthroughs. You're really great about doing that, actually. Can you tell us a little bit about what that would be like? So we've done these contingencies. Then what?
Yeah. So final walkthrough is, it's like when you have clear to close from the lender and like you're pretty much going to the closing table, you're kind of wrapping up the last few things. But the purpose of the final walkthrough is to make sure that the property is still in the condition as reported in the inspection report, if not better, but also to make sure that they left the items that they said they would leave, like the washer and dryer, the refrigerator, stuff like that. It's also, for example, I had one, it's been a while, but I had one where we did the final walkthrough a couple of days before closing, and then there was a plumbing leak in the basement. So we were like, hey, we're not going to close until this is taken care of. Luckily, the sellers got it taken care of, but it's super important. Some people don't want to do it, and they ask me what the purpose is, and that's the purpose. It's very important. I can't force you to do it, but you really should. So.
Yep. Always a good idea, just to make sure. Sometimes you got to do it the night before if you got an early morning closing or something like that. But give yourself that opportunity to discover any last minute defects that the seller may very well be unaware of. They've perhaps moved out of the home already. They don't know that a pipe burst in the basement, and that's certainly not a surprise you want to have as a buyer when you're going in and moving in when you just got your keys after closing.
Yep.
The other items that you're going to get, of course, at closing, prior to closing, is a closing disclosure. So we just call it a CD. It's not a compact disc that you play. Nathan's like, "What are those? Is that like a
whatever?
Is that like a Spotify? What's a CD, dude?" But that's a document that's gonna outline the final terms. Where all the money is, what did you pay for as a buyer, and there's a seller side too that shows what the seller paid for and was responsible for as of closing. And then at the very, very bottom is like, buyer, what you owe to buy this home, and seller, what you're going to receive as your proceeds from the sale. And then we sit down at the title company typically. Sometimes we do it at our office. I've done it at all different kinds of places, libraries, banks. You can get a mobile closer to come wherever you need to be. So the buyer and seller can have representation and a notary there. So when they're signing their final paperwork documents, that's going to be done at some form of a rep from a title company. It may be somebody that's hired third party, but somebody's going to be there to take you through all these documents that you're signing. The new deed is signed by the seller and given to the buyer and recorded. And then, a new deed will be issued then from the county. So there's a lot of paperwork that gets signed. We won't go through that right now because that's super boring.
Yeah, and it can take like an hour. So,
and if this is fine, but if you're the kind of person that wants to read everything before you sign it, you're an attorney maybe, or somebody like that, we will get you those documents ahead of time. Because if you show up to closing, which is typically a 1-hour process, and attempt to read all these documents, that will take hours. Like literally, I've seen 5-hour closings because someone insisted on reading every single document, and that's fine. But again, if you know that that's something you're going to want to do, we can get you those documents ahead of time, so you're not having to translate them as you go through. But because most of it's lawyer speak, right? It's legalese. They don't read easily, a lot of these documents. And that's pretty much it at that point. Once everything's signed, we get the funding. The money is basically released. It's all held by the title company up to that point. They release it wherever it needs to go, to the mortgage provider, to the seller. Obviously, sometimes when there are repairs, sometimes those are included as a final payment at closing. So all the money is dispersed, and then the magical moment where the keys are exchanged.
Yeah. And then, it's official. The house is sold. It's yours. So
that's it. That's the deal. The deal is done, as they say. So yeah. I think that about covers it. It seems like such a simple process because we do it all the time. But if you haven't done it before, if you haven't bought or sold a home, or maybe it's been 30 years since you've done it, the process is probably a little different.
Yeah. Again, that was a great breakdown. Any final advice for buyers and sellers navigating the escrow process?
I guess just make sure, there's always the realm of the for sale by owners. Obviously, it's complicated enough just to get your home on the market and sold. But then where do you go from that? How do you negotiate all these contingencies that we just talked about? And again, this is just a portion of what's going on. So my best advice is just get professionals around you. Please use a real estate agent. I firmly believe in what we do. Not only that, use a realtor, someone who's, taken an oath to perform above and beyond just what a real estate agent has to do. So call yourself a realtor, get some help early in the process. Make sure you're doing title insurance. You don't have to do that. You don't have to get home inspections. But when you do these things, and please do them, when you do them, make sure you're getting good referrals. Your realtor is going to know the right people for you to call. So that's the other thing. You get a realtor, they're going to guide you every step of this way and make sure that you're in the right places every step of the way. That's probably the best advice that I can give you. So buyers, be ready. Have your financing in order. Stay on top of all your deadlines, which again, Shelly, thank you. She's there every step of the way to make sure our buyers are doing that. Sellers, be upfront. Disclose any issues that make sure you're avoiding those surprises later on. Disclose. Then everybody else, just stay patient. It can take 30 to 45 days, sometimes longer, especially if there are delays while we're waiting for repairs, or maybe there is a problem with the appraisal and we've got to reappraise. There's a lot of processes that go on here. So just try and stay patient. Your lender is going to be constantly reaching out to you buyers and saying, hey, I need this paperwork. I need another stub from work. I need this. Get it to them as fast as you can. They're not doing that just to be annoying. They need that. They need to send it on to their processors and underwriters. They're not just imagining things that they can ask you for. So do everything as quickly as you can, but also try to stay patient and just communicate. If you have questions, if you have things that you're worried about, that's what we're here for. Ask us. That's always been kind of my motto, and Nate works as much as I do. If we're awake and we're not eating dinner with our lovely spouses, then we're open for business.
That's true.
So give us a call. We'll be right there for you.
Yep. And that pretty much wraps it up. And of course, like Nick said, if you have any questions about buying or selling, reach out to the Nic Wyse team. We're always here to help and happy to help. So
that's right. All right, guys. Well, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Realty Rundown with the Nic Wyse team. Remember, Nick knows, get wise replies, and we'll see you next time.
that's right. Thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.